Welcome to the Moxie OT podcast, where we invite occupational therapy practitioners, consumers, and friends of OT to talk about evidence-based practice. Today we'll be talking to Darcey Jaremy about ergonomics. Darcie is a kinesiologist and specializes in ergonomics. She is also the founder of ErgonomicsHelp, where she coaches professionals in the business of ergonomics. Darcie has worked with many OTs on their ergonomics journey, and I'm looking forward to learning more. Let's meet Darcie. Today on the Moxie OT podcast, I'm so excited to interview someone who's not an OT. We're talking with Darcey Jaremy about ergonomics. While Darcie is a kinesiologist by background, she works with many OTs, coaching them in the business of ergonomics. So many OTs have been moving into the world of ergonomics since the pandemic, so this is a great opportunity to talk to Darcie today. Darcie, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Moxie OT podcast.
Well, thanks so much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is a really great opportunity for us, so thank you. Darcie, I know you're not an OT, but like I said, you do work with a lot of OTs. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got involved in ergonomics?
Yeah, so Sarah, you hit the nail on the head. I'm not an OT, but what I've learned over the years, and even when I was doing my undergrad, is that there's a lot of common interest between what kinesiology is and OT is. And I've been lucky enough to mentor and get to know so many OTs over the years. At my university, I was fortunate that there were some really fantastic professors and courses in kinesiology that was solely geared on ergonomics.
Okay.
And I was able to take that stream really, really early on. And in fact, I can remember back to like an intro or kinesiology course, and it was probably the first month of undergrad, and they mentioned ergonomics. And I said, oh my gosh, this is what I'm going to be doing. I don't really know what it is, but I'm going to be doing it. And after my undergrad, I was fortunate enough to land this internship at one of the biggest ergonomics firms in the world. And that really set the tone of my professional life. After that, I've worked at the prevention services at the workers' compensation boards. I've consulted to companies. I've managed in-house ergonomics program to the tune of more than 10,000 employees. So I've really had a nice touch of all the different types of applications of ergonomics over the past 15 years.
Wow, that's so cool. I always think you know where you're supposed to be when that light bulb goes on in your class, or sometimes it's something in your career, but I think that's so exciting that you really found your passion so early. And you've had so many vast experiences, and now you've led those into your current business. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. And I feel so fortunate to pull on those backgrounds because like I said, like it was so many different sides of ergonomics over the years. I've managed workers' compensation claims. I was doing prevention in workers' compensation, but it wasn't until the birth of my first son about 6 years ago that I realized I needed something else. I always dreamed about doing my own consulting firm. And it had that moment of clarity again that you mentioned with the light bulb moment of undergrad. So I broke away from the 9 to 5 and I started my own ergonomics consulting biz. And I actually almost got drawn to teaching at a local college about ergonomics. I'm so happy I said no to that. And I coincidentally now teach other healthcare professionals how to get into ergonomics. And whether it's industry or office, maybe we can dive in on what exactly that means, because there is a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that intent and whatever avenue you come into ergonomics, but I specifically try to help those folks who have the intent to grow their ergonomics business in a way that they charge for their ergonomic services, because that is so much different than being an employee in a consulting firm or an organization doing ergonomics programs.
Yeah, so that's a couple of things then that we should follow up on. So I guess maybe first you can tell us, I think a lot of us, when we think about ergonomics, we do think about like the office setup, especially in the pandemic. There's been a lot of call for that, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about industry versus office ergonomics.
Yeah, absolutely. So they fall underneath the same process, which is really interesting. Fundamentally, I believe that it's a lot more simple. And just because something's simple doesn't necessarily mean it's easy, but it's a lot more simple to get into office ergonomic assessments. In industry, you need a lot more force transducers, you need scales, you need to have a really good awareness of all the different types of ergonomics assessment tools because there's 30 plus. There's so many tools based on different risk factors that you would assess in industry and the scope of the project. Now, in the office, there's a tool that you can use and it makes things a little bit easier, but you don't really need to rely on a tool because it's mostly just measuring combined with um, observations to get a really idea where the ergonomic risk is. What they have in common is that I'm sure that some of your listeners have a safety background or maybe worked in safety. There's different priorities of fixes, a hierarchy of ergonomic controls. So I think it's really important to try to engineer out the risk, whether it's office or industry. So the first level is engineering and then administrative and then behavioral, and then last but not least, personal protective equipment. So that's another level that's really interesting when it comes to office and industry. It's not only identifying and using tools to capture where the ergonomic risk is, but coming up with recommendations and solutions to reduce that to our clients.
That's so interesting. And I think that's really helpful to think about like why it's important to get training in ergonomics. I think as OTs, we're trained to observe. So, in our heads, I think we might think like, well, I'm good to go do ergonomics. I know, the basics of body mechanics and I'm a great observer. But understanding this hierarchy and what are the tools that you can use to make your assessments, that's where that further training comes in handy. So,
Yeah, and it's so cool because OTs, you have all of these awareness and background and fundamentals to would make you a really good ergonomics consultant, whether or not you want to go full into it or just as another tool on your tool belt.
yeah.
And especially that client-centered approach that I think is something that we've chatted before about that I think is so important.
Yeah, so maybe I have another question here on my list that I'm going to come back to. But since we're talking about that, one reason that we started talking is because OTs are such a great fit, and you mentioned that client-centered approach. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think OTs are so well positioned to work in ergonomics?
I would love to. And my disclaimer is that I am not an OT. Everything I know about occupational therapists comes through my own research of just looking at your profession who would be a good match to ergonomics and my members and my programs that I've talked to. They've told me these things. But one thing I have noticed is that the understanding of anatomy and physiology, and maybe you've had an introduction to ergonomics in your master's program before, that sets you up perfectly to just, it's more like a pivot, I would say, because you have all of these things and it's just applying it to a different type of, maybe a process that you've already been doing, but the ergonomics process that I've been using. So I found that students of mine who have had that background, they really have a desire that is unlike other members that I've seen, and because they've seen how it looks at the end in the client side.
Yeah, that's true too. I think with my different experiences in OT, not in ergonomics, but because I've worked in many different levels of care, I know what the outcomes, the worst case and the best case can be. And that's a motivator for me, right? Wherever I'm at, to make sure my clients have the best outcome. And,
Yes.
OTs have had their internships. They've maybe worked in outpatient OT clinics where they've had to deal with the injuries that can come from a bad ergonomic setup. So I think that's, I don't know, just one of the other many reasons why OTs might want to get into ergonomics. And
Yes.
You talked about how your coaching business is really about helping OTs and ergonomics grow their business. And I think that might be something helpful for us to learn more about. What do you mean by that? How do you help OTs do that? Why might they want to
Yeah.
work with you versus do it on their own?
Right. Yeah. And you can certainly do it on your own too. And I tried to do it on my own years ago, both learning how to do office ergonomics. So I got my start with industry. And I thought industry is very difficult. It's very hard to find the tool. But if I can do industry, it should be an absolute cakewalk doing office ergonomics assessments because you have the monitor, the keyboard, the mouse, the chair, and it's going to be the exact same no matter where you go. So I was like, cakewalk, this is going to be retirement. And it was not like that because there was once you got into the details, I found it was very challenging. And I'm sure if anyone else has tried anything new in their lives, they can relate that it's just scraping the surface of the iceberg versus diving to all the other components that might be there underneath the surface. Now, what I've found that in my experience, again, being a clinician and being an entrepreneur, there's a lot of similarities, but I find that learning how to market and almost talk business with other organizations and corporate companies that you want to work with, I found that was the challenge, and how to market ourselves and how to represent ourselves. And then once you're in those companies, how do you stay on top of the research and how do you continuously move forward with the marketing and the other stuff that we need to grow while still getting paid? So it's finding clients, developing those relationships, fulfilling on those contracts that we've made, even learning how to make a contract and going forward with revenue generating activities. But there's this other side of not revenue generating activities, but we have to build in order to put ourselves in a position to be revenue generating activities. And that's what I've done in my program. I'm I feel I talk to my students how I'm the hamster in the wheel in a way. So I do all the heavy lifting so they can focus on executing and fulfilling, because in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that execution that always is the most difficult.
Yeah, that's so great because I do think there are lots of professionals, whether they're OTs or not, who would love to have more flexibility. That was a big reason why you started this, or just have an interest in doing something different, but they don't know where to get started. And so having um, somebody kind of, here are the steps that you need to take, and just
Yeah,
laying it out there for you can really help with that fear factor, that imposter syndrome, and help you
right.
really move forward.
Right. And I should say on that side too, ergonomics isn't a regulated health profession compared to OT. Literally anyone can go off on their own and say that they're an expert or they're an ergonomist or whatever. There is a regulation, well, not a regulation board. There's the Board of Certification Professional Ergonomists in the States. And that's the gold standard because it's endorsed by the International Ergonomics Association. But there's such a big confusion between, hey, you're an OT and you can do this. It is within your scope, it's within your expertise, but it's that level of, am I ready? How do I get there? There's all these different types of certifications out there, and I think I have to get a certain type of certification before I can start. That's not the truth. You can just go, and if you want to get recognized, then you look at the BCPE, not just any certification. That is it. It's like black and white. Now, I offer certification because that's what people ask for, but I always say with the disclaimer, you don't need this. The reason why I want you to go this way is that you can get mentorship and coaching, and I review your reports. But just because you have certification, it really doesn't mean anything. You're just certified in the thing that I teach. Now,
Nice.
that is such a point of confusion in the world today. It's private label courses
Yeah.
representing themselves as perhaps something more than they are. But
Right, right. And
yeah,
I think, we see that in a lot of areas, right? Like, what does it mean if somebody has this certification? how are they different than somebody who's studied really hard in school and had mentorship from some of the
Yeah.
experts,
Yeah.
So that is good to know, like have trusted people to tell you like what certifications are worth exploring.
Mhm.
The next question on my list, and I think we kind of hit some of this with the certifications, is what kind of training do professionals typically get? So they might go for some of these certifications. Are there other um, good practices that OT or that professionals should explore before going into ergonomics?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And first of all, that's my disclaimer too. That's a great question because it's not absolutely necessary to get certified. Some of the best ergonomics consultants, most knowledgeable, valuable, make a big impact in the clients that they serve. They don't have board certification. And it's really not even required. I think it's much more important to have a good reputation and be good at what you do. However, if you want to get a government job, so work for some sort of government institution or a bigger corporation, you'll probably be required to get the BCPE. And every country in the world has their own version. In Canada, it's the CCCPE. In the States, it's BCPE. It's also the type that I have. There's a version in Australia. There's a version in South Africa and Europe too. But again, the value there is it's a tedious process. You have to really commit to it. It takes a really long time. It's difficult. And I would like everyone who's considering ergonomics is starting from the end in mind. Where are you taking this? Because one of the worst things that could happen is that you want to go down the BCPE and maybe that the coursework that you did for your undergrad or your graduate, it's just not lining up. So that puts you in another vicious cycle of going back to school and getting the right courses so you can go down the BCPE route. I'm much more of a practical person. I believe, like, again, the market will dictate who is the most valuable person in your communities and your cities, and reputation does go around. So if you're going to be going down that route, I would first figure out what the process is, do your due diligence, look at the internet, see what the thing is claiming, what they indeed are claiming, and try not to fall for, I guess, like one of the big things is some courses will say that they're OSHA certified or they follow the OSHA process. Well, it's like, that's ergonomics. Like that obviously it is. So that's kind of like a little like foxhole of trickery. Anyway.
No, that's a good tip, like that might be a red flag that
Yeah.
that you notice if you see that. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So getting kind of a little bit more into some of the specifics and some things that I got excited about as I was exploring your website, I thought it was interesting that you assess so many areas of ergonomics. You talked about office versus industry, but also I thought it was really cool that you talk about assessing mental workload. As an OT who works a lot in cognition, I thought that was really interesting, maybe something I would want to explore. So can you tell us more about how you assess mental workload?
Yeah, of course. And the way that I believe most ergonomists probably look at this is that it's this intersection between mental, physical, organizational, all of these elements coming down together, bringing the emergence of mental workload or other concerns and challenges related to how that person is thinking or cognitively reviewing and thinking that there's areas of improvement in their job. And there's a variety of ways to measure this, and it's very much dependent on the scope of what you're looking for, but what your resources have. So if you were to do like a mental workload type of assessment in a university, it would be completely different than a more of a practical approach that we would do on the shop floor or an assembly line, because when we're in those environments, there's a lot of other things going on. There's production that's happening, there's noise, there's environmental stressors that also have an effect on the mental workload. There's co-workers, so there's all these like psychosocial things going on too. So we have a practical approach, and there's a number of tools that you can use. And one of the biggest challenges and bonuses of being an ergonomist is that there's a plentiful amount of choices whenever you go into a job. That's why having the right experience and the process is really useful. And what I've noticed when I've done these before is that um, if you can improve one element of the more physical aspect of the job, and if it's a low-hanging fruit, so something that is relatively simple to put in place, then there can be a very big output of improvements, not only in the physical side, but in the cognition, the mental side. So one tool that I have used before is somewhat straightforward. It's called the NASA TLX. I did some work with that in my master's, and I believe I probably did that on my master's thesis too. I can't remember, it was so far ago, but the NASA TLX is really neat because it was developed by NASA, and there's 6 different subscales that identify concerns that either you can improve on, or it's bringing up areas that can be at least identified. And of course, whatever way that we look at this, I like to look at the whole holistic view of what exactly is going on. Let's look at the physical, let's look at the organizational, let's look at the mental side, if that's what the scope is, and then what can we do to improve that.
I love that. I love thinking about, as we've talked before, OTs love that holistic approach. So I think that's so great. And that you have, and thinking about how like the physical side does affect the mental side. So, if somebody's not stressed out about hurting themselves, maybe, then they can focus more. And honestly, I think it's kind of cool that this tool was developed by NASA. Like, I think that probably the people you're consulting with, when they hear you're using a tool used by NASA, like that,
Yeah,
them feel very confident in the tool.
absolutely. Yeah. And NASA TLX, what a cool name for a tool too.
Yeah, it does sound like a space rocket or something.
It does.
So I guess I was wondering more about what are some of the recommendations, even if they are those physical recommendations, maybe that you've commonly used to reduce mental workload, or that you
Yeah, well,
see a lot.
yeah, things that I've used before, easy as using a memory aid. So having a picture of what the finished product should look like, having a picture of maybe what deficits or other things like related to, like if there's a vigilance type of task that their person has to have a high awareness, just having cues can always help with reducing the cognitive load on a person. But at the same time, making sure that everything's set up within a good hand working height. And a really big one that I've found to be really useful is using a preventative maintenance program on a blade. This is just one example. So instead of one cut taking 10, 15 times, one cut takes one time, and that takes off the mental workload and the physical aspects of the job. So there's one solution can fix so many things.
Wow, that's so, yeah, such a simple solution. And maybe not when we're thinking about mental workload, we wouldn't think about what is the physicality of this
Right.
blade.
Yeah.
I love that. And I also love that you talked about memory cues and different kinds of cues. That's so OT. That's what we do for our other clients. So, it's like a perfect match with the
Yeah.
ergonomics.
And it works in industry. You just have to adapt it to
Yeah.
what the workers are doing on the line. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. And that makes perfect sense. Like, why wouldn't you have a picture of what
Exactly.
this should look like?
Yeah.
But again, that's not what the experts that made this product, that's not their area of expertise.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what are a few of the other standardized assessments that you find helpful in your practice?
Well, there's so many, Sarah, and that's both a blessing and a curse for
Yeah.
some folks getting into it. For industrial ergonomics, so that's more of the physicality, that doesn't necessarily need to be in industry, but anywhere when a heavy load is lifted throughout the day, and heavy can be more than 10 pounds, really, if it's part of the essential job duties of someone's position. One of the most popular ones would have to be the NIOSH lifting equation. I'm sure you've heard of that before. Snook tables, Rula, Reba. There's about 30. Well, 30 well-known ones, and it all have different components that goes into it and different outputs that you're measuring. So it's very much taking really clear measurements, watching videos of that person in that job, um, taking the heights, getting the lift distance, and we want to try to measure as much as we possibly can within that scope of that job of all the, the parts that could be resulting in ergonomic risk. And it is kind of challenging to get into this at first. And actually, about 5 or 6 years ago, I was doing my own due diligence and I was making a list of all these different ergonomics tools. And I said to myself, I don't know if I'm ever going to use this, but I'm just going to put this here. So I have about 30 tools and I did all of
Right.
this stuff. And just quite recently, about a month ago, because people in my membership, they're like, you know what? I'm in this membership for office ergonomics, but I'm getting requests for industry and I don't really have any experience at this. So what I did is that I shared all these tools with my membership. So they have all these other tools accessible now. And it's funny, it's like you're not aware what your past self can do to set yourself up for the future. So I'm saying that as a moment of reflection for all the listeners of this podcast. I'm sure there's things that maybe you've done in the past that are like, oh, wait a minute, I could use that again. There's something that I can do. So yeah, members of my membership have access to all these because there's 30 plus types of tools out there based on the risk factors. There's ACGIH and NIOSH and Snook and Rula and Reba.
Great. Yeah. I just think it's helpful to hear that there are tools to help you do this. You don't have to be able to make all the observations without, some kind of standardized assessment leading you in the right direction. So
Yes,
I,
absolutely.
and I think that's such a great member benefit that you've provided that, here's your options to
Yeah.
your members. So that's great. And I know you have some upcoming opportunities for practitioners wanting to grow as ergonomics consultants. Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at the end of June, I'm opening up enrollment for my program Accelerate. And that's the business of ergonomics. And with that, it's something that I only open up 4 times a year. And it's something that I'm super excited about because this is an opportunity if you ever have an intent to get into ergonomics as a method that can add value to what you're already doing, or if it's something as a side hustle or more of a full-time type of career direction. It's something that can help you get there. I talk about marketing a lot, but then I have the skill set and the community base to answer those really complex questions, but then how to land those clients that you've always dreamed of working with, because I found it's pretty hard to try to figure it out by yourself. And I've been working on this for 5 or 6 years at this point in time.
Yeah, I think that's so great because even if have the skills to be a great ergonomist,
It's a tongue twister.
you have great ergonomic skills.
Yes.
You might that marketing side, we don't get that in school. I think chiropractors do, but I think the most of us in healthcare professions or these kinds of professions, we don't really get that. So having those opportunities to really be guided in the right direction is a special opportunity. And so we are going to be releasing this podcast at the end of June, so that will line up perfectly. But if you're listening later, Darcie, like she said, she does open it up 4 times a year. So you haven't lost your opportunity. So this is a spot on the podcast where I always like people to have an opportunity to share a success story. So I was wondering if you wanted to share a success story with one of your clients or one of your members and how that turned out.
Yeah, I would love to. And thanks for this opportunity. It's really shifted for me because if we were talking about 5 years ago, it would have been something that I recommended to a client or some sort of ergonomic risk that I identified. And um, the results were huge or something like that. But
Mm-hmm.
recently, the way that I get such joy out of my profession is seeing other people do really well. And I'm a big fan of like really small wins, but small wins that I feel are reflective of a bigger internal mindset change. One of my members last week, she was hesitating to really get her foot out there because it's almost, I think it's almost seems harder to try to get things perfect instead of just taking action. So she was at her dentist, small win, but she had a conversation with her dentist about having ergonomics and improving the ergonomics of the front desk staff. So something incredibly simple. So she started that conversation. She offered her services. They were into it. And she talked pricing. She talked about all these things that are quite high level. And I think in the past, she was saying that she hesitated on this quite a bit, but not this time. She talked pricing. She talked about plans and what she could do, all these different options of services, something that would fit their budget. The client was into it. And she maybe didn't have this confidence in the past to do something like this. And this was someone who's been in the ergonomics industry working for someone else. But I think what most people realize when they're doing something for someone else, it's almost easier than doing things for yourself and your own company, because we always put all these different meanings on things, at least in my opinion. So she ended up moving forward with this company, and it's a really good sign of, I think, a big shift that is coming for this person and how she represents her business and how she brings her business forward.
Yeah, I love that. I think that is a great example of, you know, that is the struggle. We know, or we've done the training, we know the ergonomics principles, but it's that marketing and that mind shift. And how do you talk pricing? We get
I
into these
know.
careers because we want to be helpers,
Yeah.
not salespeople. And so I think that is a really great example of how your program specifically can really help people change that mindset and be ready to sell their business. That's
Oh yeah.
wonderful.
So it's so neat to see people do that, because now she gets to do what she wants to do in the first place, but she had to do that sales and marketing side to get her to do that. So
Yeah.
it's a different world, I think, too.
Absolutely. That's so great. Thank you for that example. Well, Darcy, at the Moxie OT podcast, we always want to make sure we provide an opportunity for our listeners to increase their Moxie. And I know you've provided us with a lot of resources today, but if a clinician wanted to start exploring ergonomics, what resources would you recommend they check out?
Well, if I haven't alienated you, their listeners at this point, please check out my website, ergonomicshelp.com. But other than that, in terms of resources to get ready and started for ergonomics, geez, that's a really good question. Mm, Probably I would suggest heading to the BCPE website, but that gives a really nice overview, things that you should be aware of with selecting an ergonomics program if you want to do that, or just how the organization represents themselves. And in addition to the International Ergonomics Association, that would be another really good resource.
Great. Those are great resources. And I'll make sure that all of those are posted on our website. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for joining us for this interesting conversation with Darcey Jaremy about ergonomics. As we discussed on today's episode, while many different professionals may work in ergonomics, OT's holistic approach is well suited for this specialty. One article I reviewed for today's episode discusses how OT practitioners are well positioned to address the needs to reduce workplace injury and disability through a preventative model. Our ability to consider the physical aspects of workplace health, as well as the mental, emotional, cognitive, and cultural aspects, allow for a more comprehensive and inclusive approach to workplace safety. The authors also described occupational therapy practitioners' unique position to advocate for a preventative model. If you're considering a career in ergonomics, this article is a great place to start. We'll have links to this article and all of the resources Darcie discussed on our website. If you want to be a part of the conversation, leave us your email address on our website. We're on all of your favorite social media channels as well. Please like and subscribe so others can join the conversation. The Moxie OT podcast was recorded in our home in the Avondale neighborhood of Chicago. This episode was produced by Brian Zira. Our intro music is courtesy of 13 Tacos Studio. Technical assistance was provided by our dog Brody. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.